Well, good morning, everyone. I'm Jeff Binder, the Associate Laboratory Director for Energy and Global Security here at Argonne, and we're really excited to be hosting this day and having this discussion. Before I get into the next session, let me just throw out as an incentive to stay to the end of the day to the question about connecting science and the future of nuclear energy. I think that's a theme that you'll hear throughout the day. And particularly at the end discussion, I think Mark and Alan and I will be making a lot of comments about the connecting of some of the basic science capabilities and what that's needed to really drive innovation in nuclear. So let me throw that out as an incentive to stay with us today. But we're going to spend the rest of the morning really focusing on the nuclear energy scene in terms of the international and the domestic community, starting with the international piece. And I'm really excited to be able to bring here today two leaders from the international space from the United Kingdom and the Republic of Korea, who are going to give us a sense of what's happening in those two countries and really from the global perspective. Our first speaker is going to be Dr. Paul Howarth. He is the Chief Executive Officer of the UK National Nuclear Laboratory, which really sits at the heart of the UK's nuclear energy program. Paul's has held various senior roles in the nuclear industry, covering R&D, energy policy, commercial and support to plant operations. He founded the Dalton Nuclear Institute at the University of Manchester prior to joining the National Nuclear Laboratory in 2009. And Paul sits on various international and national committees and boards, and he's worked closely with the British government on the development of its nuclear energy policy. And let me tell you, I heard Paul speak a few months ago, and this is a really exciting story. So please welcome Paul.
Okay, well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. And it is a fantastic honor, delight, and privilege to be here today. And I speak on behalf of my own organisation, the UK National Nuclear Laboratory, and also our sponsoring government department for energy, business and industry strategy, and also for the United Kingdom's Nuclear Sector Council, which has recently been formed by Her Majesty's government to look at how we take nuclear forward in the United Kingdom. When the invitation came through from Paul and from Jeff, I was obviously delighted to accept it. And I noted that it was recognising 75 years of nuclear. And in most cases, the United Kingdom, when it comes to history, normally wins hands down over the United States. And many of you will know, I have friends and colleagues here, quite often enjoy a friendly rivalry with my colleagues here at the US National Labs, often, of course, referencing such as you think you drive on the right side of the road, but of course it's actually the wrong side. And we, of course, have aluminium rather than aluminum. So when the challenge came through about 75 years of nuclear, I thought, that's going to be one that's difficult to beat. So I thought I'd give it a go. So 160 years ago, in Cumbria, a gentleman, John Dalton, announced his atomic theory. And he announced it at the Manchester Literature and Natural Philosophical Society. He wasn't far off as far as his model was concerned in terms of having a nucleus. He got it a bit wrong in terms of where the electrons were, but not bad for 160 years ago. The interesting thing is he came from a small village, Eaglesfield, in Cumbria, which is about 2 miles outside the Georgian market town of Cockermouth, where I have a house, because Cockermouth and Cumbria, of course, is very close to the Sellafield nuclear facility. So when I started my career in nuclear about 25 years ago, and I was driving to site at Sellafield, I would drive through this tiny hamlet called Eaglesfield, not realizing at that time that over 100 years ago, that was where John Dalton lived, and he announced his atomic theory. So it just goes to show it is a small world. What's interesting actually then is the engagement I had at British Nuclear Fuels, and then later on setting up the Dalton Nuclear Institute at Manchester University. So if we cast forward now from when he came up with this theory, and we move forward 150 years, so 10 years ago, I had a phone call from the Lord Lieutenant of the Duke of York's office, Prince Andrew, who said that Prince Andrew wishes to come to visit you at the Dalton Nuclear Institute. And that was quite an interesting invitation to receive. It was genuine, not a hoax. And his interest was around nuclear. So I thought, okay, well, I'd better make sure that I'm up to speed with my history as far as nuclear research is concerned at Manchester. And it is actually a fascinating history as far as Manchester is concerned. Obviously, of course, the start of the Industrial Revolution, but they recognised the importance of science, technology and engineering all those years ago. And what they actually wanted to do was to push the boundaries of science and technology, and they recognised nuclear was potentially an area that was going to be of great importance as far as science was concerned. So what did they do? They built, with the investment and the wealth that had come from the Industrial Revolution, they built a laboratory to rival the Cavendish Laboratory at Cambridge, to then attract the world's brightest and best to come to work there. I'm quite passionate about Manchester because that's my hometown of birth, and it's fantastic to understand the heritage there, to then see that what they effectively did was to bring together three important ingredients: funding, the facilities, and then get the people. And for me, as far as my organisation is concerned today, I still hold those three things true. You need the funding, you need the people, and you need the facilities, and then you can do world-class research. And that's exactly what happened at Manchester, because they attracted Ernest Rutherford, who then won his Nobel Prize for splitting the atom in the early 1900s. And then when I took the Duke of York round Manchester University, I was able to point out all the historical names that we recognise from nuclear science, technology and engineering that worked with Rutherford, or were his students: Niels Bohr, de Broglie, Thomson, Bragg, Geiger, Chadwick, and countless others in terms of the names of those historical figures. And it's really quite a shock. I certainly found it a shock to realise the history. We then accelerate forward. We go through Otto Hahn's discovery in 1938, and then we come to CP1, a critical facility, literally, that was developed here in the United States. The Manhattan Project, a strong collaboration between the US, the UK, and between Canada. I particularly liked the historical period where the United States actually thought that Britain was ahead at the start of the Manhattan Project and wrote to Winston Churchill requesting to be involved and to collaborate on the program. Winston Churchill subsequently ignored the letter, which unfortunately then it was discovered that the Americans were advancing much faster than the British. So the British then wrote back eventually to the Americans and said, actually, we haven't got any money now after the war. We think that you may have made some technological advances. We'd very much like to come to the United States and we will lead your program for you. And interestingly, that didn't go down very well. But then we cast forward to, Steve mentioned in terms of commercial power, and Calder Hall in Cumbria is the home of the first civil commercial nuclear power plant. Now, quite interestingly, of course, Idaho with the fast breeder reactor did power the town of Arco, and did it slightly before Calder Hall, and that's why in the UK we have to refer to the first commercial civil nuclear power. We have to just forget about what happened at Arco and Idaho for a minute. But that was opened by the Queen. So that's quite interesting, isn't it? Prince Andrew comes to see the Dalton Nuclear Institute, and in 1951, his mother, she's still working today, think of that, opened the Calder Hall nuclear power plant. And then, very interestingly, when I was elected to the Royal Academy, I met the patron of the Royal Academy, which is the Queen's husband, Prince Philip. And I found out in conversation that Prince Philip is a staunch advocate of nuclear. And he asked me, he said, "So Paul, what is it you do then?" So I said, "I work at Sellafield in the nuclear industry." "Oh, very interesting. Are we going to be building some new nuclear reactors, Paul?" I said, well, yes, but we really need to ensure that we're dealing with our legacy waste to start with. It's a challenging program, and then we can think about nuclear reactors. So are we going to be building some of these reactors, do you think then, Paul? I said, yes, Prince Philip, we will, but we really have a big job to do as far as legacy waste is concerned. Paul, I really think you need to get on and build some of these bloody reactors, you know. So there we have it. The nuclear royal family is truly nuclear. So let me just move on as far as the UK's nuclear heritage is concerned, because then I think, as Steve illustrated in his presentation, things progress extremely rapidly for countries that are progressing nuclear through the 50s and the 60s. Whether it was light water reactors, heavy water reactors, gas-cooled, liquid metal-cooled, we've done it all. We've looked at metal fuel, oxide, carbide, triso-coated, pellet fuel, vibro-packed. Just like you guys, we tried and tested everything. We pioneered all the activities. We reprocessed, we closed the fuel cycle, we've looked at direct disposal. We're now into long-term interim storage, and in fact we have all of those three back-end policies ongoing at the same time at the moment in the UK. And also, of course, we've looked at all the waste treatment and encapsulation technologies. We have an incredibly extensive programme in the United Kingdom. Steve showed the organogram of all the different departments that exist looking at nuclear. Legacy, and we have the same in the UK. Legacy waste programme, we have fuel fabrication, defence, geological disposal, continued operation of existing reactors, building new nuclear reactors, and even looking at future space missions. And just as an aside, light-hearted moment, recently I came home from work and my smallest 10-year-old son said to me, "So, Dad, what have you done today at work?" Sorry. He said, "I had an absolutely fantastic day." I said, "In the morning I met the Admiral of the Nuclear Naval Fleet to talk about the support to the programmes, and in the afternoon I met the European Space Agency to talk about the ExoMars mission and how nuclear will provide the power for that." Little Sam just looked at me and said, "Yeah, right, Dad, so what did you really do today?" So how many people, honestly, can work in industries that are so diverse and exciting, covering so many opportunities? In the United Kingdom, our reactor systems were based on graphite. They were the backbone. They were gas-cooled systems. They had magnesium alloy cladding because we didn't have access to enrichment technology at the time. And of course, they were based on what were originally the wind-scale piles for producing the plutonium. We had to reprocess that material because the fuel was unstable. Our Magnox Generation 1 reactors have subsequently retired. They've reached their end of life. They worked for 50-odd years, generating a lot of electricity as far as the UK is concerned, much beyond what was anticipated. Our Generation 2 systems, advanced gas-cooled reactors, are now the workhorse and also the single PWR reactor. We also, of course, developed the fast reactors, and Steve referred to the oil shocks, and that gave an emphasis on the programme as far as closing the fuel cycle was concerned. We certainly felt the oil shocks, as many other countries did. We had a dilemma around the 1970s and the 1980s about whether to stay with gas-cooled systems or switch to light water reactor systems. And what so often happens in the history between the United Kingdom and the United States is we're actually quite good at the innovation, but we're absolutely rubbish at the production and just standardizing the units. Look at Concorde versus the 747. We did the same with reactors, and effectively the development of the light water reactors here in the United States really showed the way for just producing standard reactor systems that could be deployed on a broad scale. Nuclear in the United Kingdom basically covered around about 15 gigawatts and about 30% of our electricity mix. And what has happened during the time is, and I described it last night to a number of colleagues, it's like it's a dimly lit candle that's blowing in the wind at the moment as far as the nuclear renaissance programme in the UK. Sometimes it's looking hopeful, and then it just dies out a little bit. Then it looks more hopeful, but we hope that the programme can start. We have been through some difficult times. In the 1980s, we were then looking at progressing fast reactor technology. What happened? We then discovered North Sea gas, and we decided to close the fast reactor programme. Also, of course, Chernobyl happened. That was a further dent in the prospects for nuclear in the United Kingdom. Sizewell B, our only pressurised water reactor, eventually came online in the 1990s, but that was an extremely difficult, painful process of getting a single reactor on the bars. Effectively, we took a standard Westinghouse reactor and literally in the Village Hall public inquiry, it was redesigned. And it was redesigned, making it more complex. The licensing process took an awful lot longer. And basically what was then going to be a fleet build program, the reactors were cancelled and we only ended up with Sizewell B. So again, we tried to have another nuclear renaissance, but we failed. Cast forward to 2003, an energy white paper then came out from the government, and it was very admirable in its aims. It recognised the importance of CO2 and the need to reduce it, and we then had legally binding targets. We now have further legally binding targets by 2050 and 80% reduction in CO2 emission. But one thing was missing from that 2003 energy white paper. The chapter was written, so-called Chapter 4, and it was pulled out right at the last minute. Chapter 4 was about the renaissance of nuclear. But what happened? British Energy, which runs the UK reactors, went into administration and the government had to bail it out. And literally that chapter was pulled out of the document and put to one side. And nuclear effectively then ended up on a course of phase out. So within British Nuclear Fuels, we got together, we formed a small group, the Energy Unit, that basically set about building the case for the renaissance of nuclear in the United Kingdom. We would do things a government organisation wouldn't do, so we had to undertake a lot of lobbying with ministers, with the House of Lords, with industry. We had to bust the myths. We had to explain how you can build nuclear, what went wrong in the past with Sizewell B, how we could do it again in the future. At the time, engaging with ministers, it was very difficult. They would simply turn around and say, Paul, I absolutely hear what you are saying, but no developers are coming to beat our door down to build a nuclear power plant. So why should we do anything to support the industry? It was an extremely difficult time. I used to spend a lot of time down in Whitehall in 1 Victoria Street in countless difficult meetings with the government, and I would come out with my head down just waiting for the first red bus that would go past, and I would want to jump underneath it. It was an extremely painful process. But something changed, and a little spark helped us. And that little spark was when the Russians and Putin announced that he was going to cut the gas supplies to the Ukraine. And then suddenly, the UK government realised energy is not a commodity. It is about security of supply. And literally the next day, the phone rang and said, right, come and tell us, how are we going to launch a new nuclear power programme? And we said, 3 things that you've got to do. Get the licensing sorted out. Don't do what happened with Sizewell. Do it once. Do a generic design assessment and never revisit it in the local planning inquiry. Number 2, get the waste management policy sorted out. Give the guarantees in terms of the cost of waste. And over a certain amount, government can back it. And number 3, provide guarantees over the electricity price. Do those 3 things and developers will come. That's exactly what happened. What happened then was the government launched an energy consultation, but it did a very smart move in that energy consultation. In the energy consultation about whether or not to have nuclear, you couldn't simply respond by saying you didn't want nuclear. Remember that 1970s sticker, nuclear power, no thanks? You couldn't respond to that. Your response to the government was ignored. You had to give an alternative, and it had to be a credible alternative. And that was a game changer. And then so what happened in 2008, 2009, the new nuclear build program was launched. The intention then, when the developers turned up, which they did, was to run a competition to determine the supply chain componentry from the UK and also the strike price that would be determined. Everything was looking good. We also saw our European colleagues looking towards nuclear. Switzerland was going to go nuclear. Believe it or not, Germany was really close. Italy with Berlusconi was very close. Belgium was reconsidering nuclear. It was looking really good. Then something happened, Fukushima. And again, the flame just dies out a little bit. Fortunately, it remains strong in the United Kingdom. And the United Kingdom, we recognised that it was the safety of existing nuclear plants compared to those early plants. Unfortunately, though, the competition fell away, and the German utilities pulled out. We were left with only EDF, and then we've been on the process now of determining the strike price. We've finally got to the position of having a strike price. The number is £92 a megawatt hour. It's roughly just under $150 a megawatt hour. We would like to see that figure come down. But again, it comes back to looking at fleet build. So finally, the programme has started, and it started with Hinkley Point C. Issues that we have suffered there go on, basically, because we have recently seen auctions for renewables, offshore electricity from wind power. Recent auctions see the price coming in at around about $100. So it's less than nuclear. So nuclear is now strongly challenged as far as cost is concerned. But then we were looking at other power plants starting, of course, AP1000 with Westinghouse. So the flame goes up a little bit. But then, of course, Westinghouse hits its difficulties with Toshiba, so the flame goes down a little bit. The thing I say to ministers at the moment is you've got to keep the faith. We have got to get to fleet build. Fleet build is essential for us as far as nuclear is concerned. Fortunately, the government has launched something now, the industry strategy, and this recognises that certain industry sectors have a very big impact on the economy. They are long-duration industry sectors, things such as defence, automotive, aerospace, etc. It's about security of supply, electricity, infrastructure. These are critical sectors that employ many tens of thousands of people. And nuclear absolutely fits in that category. It's billions of pounds, it's tens of thousands of people. And it covers whole sectors beyond just science and engineering. It covers education, regulation, the finance sector, insurance. Unfortunately now, the government has recognised the importance of nuclear as a sector. And it's recognised also the time frame that's associated with nuclear. Hinkley Point C will operate for at least 60 years, 80 years. It could potentially go to 100 years of operation. We've got to keep the faith. We've got to get to fleet build. We, of course, then, in terms of the flame, we see the flame dim slightly because we have Brexit now, and government is distracted with the implications of Brexit. But fortunately, it's recognised the importance of the nuclear industry to the United Kingdom, the importance of science, technology, engineering and innovation, the importance of infrastructure, and the importance it plays as far as the regional economy is concerned. What we need now is a strong and powerful vision for the role that nuclear plays as far as the UK economy is concerned. This is where it gets interesting, because the government then set up a programme looking at calculating how are we going to get our 80% reduction in CO2 emissions in the latter half of this century. And they came up with a very innovative model. It's available on the web, and it's for anybody to use, and anybody can determine how they're going to do it. And I sat in the meetings with the Chief Scientist Advisor looking at getting the model up and running, and you can slide in and out different technologies. Biomass can go up, domestic heat, light and power can come down, tidal can go up. We set the model up, we started it off, and the first condition was no nuclear. Okay, close the model, get to 80% reduction in CO2 emissions. The model comes up with some bizarre answers. You need 85% of the UK land mass for biomass energy. You need to ring the UK 3 times in tidal wave power systems. You need so many offshore wind turbines, you can't get any shipping in and out for the United Kingdom. Eventually they said, okay, all right, okay, fine. Start ramping up the nukes. Let's see what happens. You get to a very interesting situation. And the killer thing that changes this whole game is the electrification of the transportation sector. And that's what we are seeing now. And in fact, we are getting caught out. We look in the United Kingdom, the rate of growth of Tesla vehicles, it's exponential. And the government is not responding fast enough to it. The grid size has got to go up a factor of 4. Our 80 gigawatt grid has got to go up to a 320 gigawatt grid if we wish to hit an 80% reduction in CO2 emissions. The answer is a third, a third, a third. It's a third of renewables, that's 100 gigawatts. We currently have around about 5, and that's intermittent. We need 100 gigawatts of fossil fuel with sequestration. Sequestration is an unproven technology. We therefore need at least 100 gigawatts of nuclear. that gets frightening. And that's when they turned to me in the room and they said, Paul, can we do 100 gigawatts of nuclear? Well, there are countries that do have large grids, such as in France, Japan, the US. It is possible. If we look at the ramp rate then, and the ramp rate is important, how quickly can we build these reactors? And a whole industry is needed behind it. But it's not just the rate of expansion from an engineering point of view. The killer factor now that's facing us in terms of a nuclear program is financing. It's the cost of capital. That's what's hitting us really hard. The outlay is proving to be too much. How many organizations can stomach on their balance sheet construction of nuclear power plants at over billions of pounds? But we have to find a solution to this. This is really where I turn to the role of innovation. And if we look to future reactor systems, we have a role to play as far as the national labs are concerned. We need to identify the technologies that can help governments to determine the future of nuclear power. We need to look at advanced reactor systems. We need to look how to improve the safety. We need to look at what's happening in other industry sectors as far as the rapid expansion of technologies, the digital technology, the manufacturing technology in 3D printing, the automotive autonomous systems and robotics. We need to ensure that as a role of the national laboratory, whether in the United Kingdom or the United States, we're doing the difficult work. We're doing the difficult demonstrating of technologies. It doesn't happen in universities and it doesn't happen in industry. It sits in the middle. It sits in TRL 4, 5 and 6. And that's the role that we have to play to support our governments, to inform them to make decisions around the future of nuclear. But it could be bright for the UK. We can get to the first tranche of 16 gigawatts. We can go up to 32. We may even get higher, up to 75. We could be looking at going back to generation 4 systems. We could be looking at small modular reactors. There are substantial engineering challenges. And I come back to where I started this presentation. The important thing is you need organizations that have a long-term future, that have the funding, that have the facilities, and have the people that are going to be available in order to underpin energy policy for the future. Thank you very much for listening.